Well, hello, 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 my mighty 10,000. It is God's comic, Brad Stine, and here we are again for Brad Stine Has Issues, where comedy, conservatism, and Christianity collide in a cacophony of clarity. And it doesn't get any more clarifying than this. Today, we have a man who was actually a writer and line producer for That 70's show, and he's also, are you ready for this? Hang on your hats, a Christian. How could a writer, line producer for That 70's show actually be a Christian? Well, when you hear some of the other shows that he was a writer and producer on, you are going to be shocked and amazed. And if you're a legalist, oh, you're going to have the time of your life judging and slandering and going after this man and questioning his salvation. But for the rest of us, we're just going to hang on for the ride and hear the amazing story of Dean Batali, someone who I've known for many years, tried to actually pitch a sitcom with. And he's going to be with us here shortly, so we're going to have a lot of fun. But we still have things to talk about prior to that. As a matter of fact, one of the things we have to talk about is how this show continues to happen every Monday. And it happens because somebody pays us. What a week it has been. I don't know if you pay attention to the news. If you do, you probably have a horrible life. You're probably on some kind of medication, some kind of drugs. Wyatt, they're probably medicating themselves as we speak, because the news, if you haven't noticed, really isn't as effective unless it bleeds, as they say. Wyatt, did you check the news this week?
Yep, stabbed it with a fork, definitely bleeds.
Anything pop out? Anything majestically amaze you about what happened this week here?
I saw a bone poke out, but other than that, not really.
Okay, so it was like a massive wound, but you survived and hobbled to your little cryptic area there and started the show.
No. I didn't stab myself. I stabbed the news. You said to check to see if it bleeds.
Yeah, the news is the news. You know, folks, there was some very interesting things I wanted to talk about. For those of you who watch Brad Stine Has Issues, and you do because you want to be rewarded by God, and he does reward my viewers. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, because you feel sorry for me. But anyways, I told you guys I don't know, it might have been over a year or two ago, actually, that I had a serious struggle. Now, one of the things you guys know that I care about, that I stand for, that is important to me, is free speech. That is about as sacrosanct as it gets when it comes to if there is a spiritual side to the Constitution, it's our First Amendment right of free speech. And that means that it's speech that I hate has to be allowed to be thrown into the atmosphere, whether I like it or not. But it doesn't mean I have to agree with that speech. I don't have to okay that speech. I can judge and assess that speech as you can mine. And if we do that together, we become what is known as a free country, because it can only be free if people can disagree, and especially on areas that we completely are at two ends of the spectrum together. So I say that because one of the things that happened to me a few years ago, it was during the the football season initially, with the Black Lives Matter protests. And as I said to folks, you know, you are a free citizen if you are part of the United States of America, and you are a citizen, and you can protest your government. It's part of the promises given to you in the First Amendment. It's a wonderful promise. It's a crucial promise. As a matter of fact, it's a promise that very few other countries give you access for. Certainly not totalitarian or despotic or authoritarian or fascist or communist countries. They don't give you an access or a right to disagree, and especially to say it in front of everybody so that everybody can hear your point of view, as though you're not controlled by the government or some sort of strong-arm system that is keeping you at bay and basically controlling your life. So I'm grateful that people can say and do and think what they want. Now, that also has the right, and this is tricky, with celebrities. What I mean by that is we all get sick of hearing the actors going off on some tangent of some political realm that they've decided that is crucial for everybody to believe and agree with, so that they can go back into their little walled mansions and make their millions upon millions of dollars, glitz off to France and to whatever else they choose to go on their private jet to get into their private yacht for their private vacation, the whole time lecturing the rest of us and how we learn to have to be more compassionate towards the poor and those who are affected and are the other. So the hypocrisy is not lost on me or anyone, but nevertheless, I think what we've seen is the market will do its damage. And how has it done that? Well, it did that, let's say, for example, the Oscars. I remember at a time when I was young that I used to watch the Oscars. It was fun. It was interesting. I loved movies. I'd go to movies and I'd want to see, who's going to win the best actor, who's going to win the best movie, and so forth and so on. And then they started to get political. I remember seeing, I think it was 72, is when Marlon Brando won Best Actor for The Godfather, but he didn't take his award. He sent up an Indian woman to say, he can't take it because I think maybe they filmed the movie on stolen land, or that the Native Americans were not being treated properly. That was his stance. So he turned it into a little political moment. And that's the first time I remember just going, what is this all about? I just wanted you to get your Oscar and you did a great job. But I don't know if that was the first time a political element was explored during the Oscars, but it certainly kept going and going. And now it's so ridiculous that people just don't watch it anymore, and haven't for many, many years, except for leftists who want to hear leftist actors talk about leftism. Those guys will continue to watch. And why wouldn't they? It's their religion. But athletes have done the same thing. And again, these are citizens of the United States, if they are, and that means they have a right to speak and think and do as they choose. And I don't have a problem with that. Once you finish the game or the, film or whatever it is, and you want to go off into your private life and say and speak and think and do whatever you want, you have that right, and I want you to have it, even if I vehemently disagree with what it is you're standing for. But what you shouldn't do, I don't think, is do it during the game. The game is a game for everybody. It is a business. It's a private business, right? I mean, if I own a franchise to a major league team, then I get to kind of run the show the way I want to, other than there is a governing board like the Major League Baseball or NFL that does have certain rules and regulations about, what you can put on your clothing, or what you can't do this, or you can't do that. So there is some sort of grand scheme of how things are allowed to be done. But for the most part, you also can do your own kind of special nights. We're going to have, whatever, Boy Scout night, or, Mother's Day night, whatever you want to do. So that's fine too. Well, the Dodgers had a Pride night a few years ago, and one of the people that they celebrated was, I think it was the Nuns of Perpetual Agony, or so, I don't even remember anymore. But it was basically men in drag, nun drag, mocking and ridiculing Christianity and the church and the people in it. And I mean blasphemous stuff, not just disagreeing, but blasphemy. And so I couldn't believe this. I was waiting for the Dodgers, and there was a handful of Christians there to say, we're not going to put up with that. No, we won't even perform or go up and do this if this is how we're going to be represented, because it doesn't represent me. And I'm also a human, and I'm also American. I'm also a citizen. I also have agency to make my choices and my decisions. And so this does not represent me. And it frustrated me because it went beyond a disagreement. It went into blaspheming my faith. And keeping in mind that Christians are the number one persecuted religious group on earth, I felt it was so disrespectful to so many Dodger fans. And I've been a Dodger fan since 1963, when my dad used to set me on his lap and we listened to the radio and listened to, I called them the Rogers, but they're the Dodgers. And he turned me on to them, and they became my team. And him and I went to the 1974 World Series Game 2 and watched the Dodgers win. We went to the 1977 World Series Yankees and Dodgers and watched the Dodgers win, and Mike Welch strike out Reggie Jackson. I was behind home plate, watched it happen. So I have wonderful memories with my dad, and also them winning the World Series in 1981 and 1988. So, these were special times, and it was a connection that I had. And then they did that. The Dodgers became a different team. They were no longer family values, but in fact, despised those families that have traditional values and decided to honor, not just to have on their field, but honor people who dishonored and hated and despised my faith. I said, that's it. Took my Dodger shirt off and say, I'm not following these guys anymore. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life because I had followed them my entire life. My father's passed away. That was a connection I had with him and I, and the Dodgers. So that being said, this week, the Dodgers had another Pride night, and so they had the L.A. Dodger logo on their hat in a rainbow flag. Now, again, I didn't frankly even pay attention. It just happened to show up on my news feed because I don't watch them anymore. So I wouldn't have even known they did it. I'd already left and abandoned them. They wanted nothing to do with me, clearly, because people of faith, they don't care and respect or care about us participating and being fans. They destroyed 50, 60 years of fandom that I had with these guys because of that horrible incident. And so it doesn't matter. They're making billions and they don't need me. But I had to make my stand. I had to stand for what I believed. Well, Clayton Kershaw, who is a very committed Christian, as far as I know, never met him, don't know him, though his agent is the husband of Gretchen Carlson, who is a friend of mine. So that's as close as of my 7 degrees of separation I've gotten to Clayton Kershaw. Anyways, he had put a Bible verse, a Genesis Bible verse, he wrote onto his cap, pointing to the rainbow. Basically, it was Noah and God putting out a rainbow to say, this is my covenant I make with you, that I will never again flood the earth and destroy it. So that was his way of saying, okay, well, if I got to wear this rainbow, let me remind you where it came from, where the first origins of a rainbow came from, and what God says it means. That was his way of doing it. So for a second, I thought to myself, wow, okay, is he standing up for something? Is that a repentance? Should I return to the Dodgers? Because that's all I've ever said. Just like with the National Football League, which allowed men to kneel during a game against the national anthem, as opposed to men doing it privately on their own, but at the game saying, hey, this is what we're going to stand for, a particular leftist Marxist idea, and you want me to pay money to watch this? Nope, I'm out and I won't watch a game until they repent and pay money to the veteran services, give them $1 billion like they gave to BLM, and say, sorry, we won't do that again. We're just going to play games. Then I'll come back. That's all. I'm a Christian. We have to allow people to repent, and we have to allow people to be forgiven, just like I needed desperately. And I thought, well, maybe this gives me a break. He stood for this thing, and he said, this is not what I believe in. I'm going to stand for my faith. But it was Clayton, one Christian, God bless him, but not the Dodgers itself says, no, this matters to us. This is very, very important to us that we stand for this type of behavior and not a moral behavior that God established. So I realized, well, I can't go back. So that was sort of an interesting interlude of me re-seeing what it looked like for Dodgers to continue on the path of taking a side instead of taking a neutral venue and allowing everybody access to their team. That being said, we're going to leave the political realm and my little rant, and we're going to move to the spiritual realm. For those of you who've ever watched Daily Brads, they show up usually every day, not always, once in a while I miss one, but they're on my YouTube. Please go to Brad Stine Has Issues and subscribe, and you can get Daily Brads. So I think it's very important that we not only look at the culture and how we can redeem it and bring our faith into it, which is what is necessary in America, a re-remembrance of Christ and Christianity and a reawakening of this country if we're going to have a chance to survive. So that is looking at culture, looking at law, but it's also the spiritual realm has to go first. So I started my series, God is Everywhere. You just have to learn how to look, in my daily bread. So today we are going to take a little peek at a spiritual conversation I had with you and everybody watching. This week goes like this. Good morning, Earth. It's God's comic, Brad Stine. This is your daily Brad, continuing on the series, God is Everywhere and Everything. You have to choose to see it. Today, as I walk, it's a Sunday morning in Tennessee, and it's been raining, and the trees are singing, and the birds are chirping, and the ground is wet and damp and thick, and the smell is the smell of life. You only have two choices. You can experience this phenomenon that I'm experiencing, and if you're alive, you have. You've been in the rain and the aftermath of the rain. You only have two choices. There's nowhere else to go. When you experience this beauty, this joy, this life, invigorating life moment, which you didn't conjure up. It's not something you looked at the water and said, shall I see this as miraculous? Shall I see this as invigorating? Or shall I see it as a chemical component of hydrogen and 2 parts of oxygen? Nobody does that, including the materialist and the chemist. They still love the rainy aftermath of the natural cycle of how the earth works. So you have to choose. Did this happen by accident? Is there this water that falls out of the sky, which sounds kind of like a fantasy novel, right? That one lives in an environment that needs water to survive. And so it magically falls out of the sky every now and again without warning and replenishes the lakes and the oceans and the streams and the wells. And we're grateful for it, and we know it's coming. As a matter of fact, if there's a drought, we feel like something has gone wrong. The natural cycle of water has ceased, and we need it to live. So we see it as an aberration, we see it as a curse, and throughout history people have even sacrificed fellow humans to make the gods happy again, so they would give us water. Do you see this as a natural phenomenon? Materialists do. They take it for granted. Well, of course, this is how it works. This is the water cycle. Evaporation, clouds, oversaturation, falls back down. Constant cleansing, constant replenishing. All the water that's ever existed is all here. It's still here on Earth, never going anywhere. You cannot account for how that works if you didn't put it into place, if you didn't create it, and of course no human did. You live in it and its bounty. You're grateful for it, and as I said earlier, you can revel in its glorious invigoration. But you didn't do it. You didn't create it. You didn't make it work. You had nothing to do with it. It simply happens, and you expect it to continue. Now, the only time in our human experience that we see things happen and that they continue to happen and they're for our good and they're designed as such is because they're designed. Because an engineer or an architect or a king or a president or a group of people in a village saw a need and decided to try to overcome that. It's always designed. We observe what is needed and we fix it. Oh, look, we need water. Well, what if we were to take this river and siphon water off and put it over here where there is no river? Suddenly we'll have crops, and we did it. What if we were to create umbrellas because it's going to suddenly drop water on us periodically? This will keep us dry. So we created umbrellas. Every time we use the necessary material, natural function of the world and try to focus it on means of bettering the lives of fellow humans and keeping us healthy and strong. We choose to do it. We decide to do it. We look at it and observe it and draw conclusions as why it's necessary, how it works, and how to make it function the most practically and helpful to us. We want to live, and we want to do it in a way that is the most peaceful and consistent. We forget that in many parts of the world, as we speak, most people can't walk into their home. They don't have one. It's a hut or a shack, and push a button or pull a lever and water magically appears, hot or cold. Most people on this earth don't have that. And we in the West think, well, of course that's how you do it. We take it for granted. Most people have to go dig a well. And it's hard. Sometimes you gotta dig a bunch of wells to find the water. So, throughout human history, we've had to find ways to provide the water on a consistent basis. It was always designed and engineered that way. Again, every time we do it, we decide to. And yet, in the meta-narrative, in the biggest possible observation of the natural world, it happens for us. The water comes from the sky, and it's consistent. We can even predict it somewhat. Why would that not be designed? Why wouldn't that be part of the Creator's architecture? If it didn't rain anymore, water disappeared, we'd all go. And yes, after thousands of years, that isn't happening. What an amazing coincidence. Just happened to work that way. That's why we happen to evolve out of nothing. Or something had us in mind and not only created our ability to survive and to flourish and to be able to help others, but we're just replicating what he did first. What if there's a designer behind all this? And when you think like that, even an atheist, if you thought that there's someone that does this and created this and keeps it happening, it answers your questions. But you don't see him like you do a tap. You don't feel him like you do the rain. And so you disregard him. Even though every time I turn my tap on in my faucet, I don't wonder if there's an engineer somewhere who's treating this water and it's in a plant somewhere and they're pushing it through the pipes. I know they're there. Maybe that's another proof of God. The rain. This is God's Comic, Brad Stine. This is your Daily Brad. So it's just me thinking and walking and contemplating and letting God work through me. But you know what? If there's anybody that I don't have a problem working through me, because he is just my compatriot, my partner in crime. Not that we commit crimes, but it just sounds more dramatic. And really, some of that helps me walk through life, because I think if things are really getting tough and rough, and I feel like maybe things aren't working out the way I'd wanted to, I can always look at his life and say, well, it can't be that bad. My son, Wyatt Leroy Stein. Wyatt, what in the heck are you doing on Brad Stine Has Issues when you could be taking a nap?
I don't know. I really want a nap. Can we stop the facility, please?
No, but what I do want you to know is that I'm excited for Dean Batali. Now, I don't know if you have did you ever hear of that 70's show?
Which one?
That 70's show?
Yeah, I know. Which one, though?
The one that had that 70's show in the title?
Oh, that 70's show.
Yeah, that one. Well, anyways, that's... where did I go? That 70's show... it was a very, from what I understand, because I never watched it once. I mean, literally not one episode, ever. You know why, Wyatt?
Because you failed to do your research before we recorded these?
No. No, that's true.
Because you don't care about the final arts?
Do you know why I didn't watch that 70's show, Wyatt? I'll tell you why. Because, son, I lived that 70's show. I was a teenager in the 70's. I was there. I didn't need a fake sitcom to remind me of the 70's, because I was part of the 70's. I remember guys driving around. Now, I'm in Southern California back in those days, and guys driving around. Everybody had vans back in those days, Chevy vans, and there was even a song about a Chevy van, but I think it had to do with some inappropriate physical connections and so forth, which is not appropriate for this particular Christian broadcast. But nevertheless, it was a famous song. But anyways, I knew guys that actually had Chevy vans, and they would have these cool paintings on the outside of them, like of sunsets or whatever. That was just the cool thing to do. And they'd have a couch in there, and it was just the thing to do in the 70's. Why? You weren't part of the 70's. You have to read about it. You have to watch that 70's show to even know what was happening. Not me. I was there.
I still can't believe they actually had airplanes in the 70's.
Why?
Well, I mean, it's so archaic back then. I thought all they had was like horse and buggy and like, I don't know, Frisbees or something.
Well, they did have horse and buggy, though they were kind of being, phased out, I'll be honest. They did have Frisbees, though I believe the Frisbee was invented in the 50's. Certainly in the 60's is when it became popular. Do you know how they came up with Frisbee, by the way?
Well, they invented Frisbee golf, but they needed a ball.
No, that's not even close.
Oh, they wanted to make a ball, but they accidentally flattened it in a steamroller?
No, not even scratching the surface of truth.
Ooh. Kid-friendly clay pigeons.
No, not close. Again, so yeah, that's the strike three, and we were talking about baseball earlier.
Well, I mean, it would be like the lawn darts of skeet shooting.
Yeah, it would be, except that they are safe, actually. Frisbee lawn darts, which, by the way, were in the 60's.
Yeah,
and the 70's.
I know. I
was
saw that
part
on the
of
show.
it. I was part of the 70's. I was part of the lawn. I had lawn darts.
Did you ever use them like often?
Yeah,
you did.
They were fun. It was basically like playing horseshoe, where a lobotomy was possible.
I was gonna get at the fact that you experienced lawn darts as a child growing up, and that probably explains why we're here today.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And I'm safe and secure, but there was some close calls. Anyways, I don't remember when, and I'm not looking it up like you have the option to do, but I think it may have been the 40's, but at least the 50's. I think it was like New Jersey or something, believe it or not. There was a Frisbee's pie shop, if I remember this correctly. And the guy made like tin he made pies in a tin, a pie tin, and it said Frisbee on it because it was Frisbee. That was the name of the guy. And these people, and I think they were like Harvard or something. They were like, eggheads. They would finish the thing, and they realized they could toss the thing, and it would go like a disc, right? And they could play catch with it. And so they started playing that, and they called it a Frisbee because it said Frisbee. So somewhere, Whammo, or whoever it is that did it, must have bought the rights to it and called it that, and they turned it into a plastic thing. But it all happened from pie tins and college kids who didn't have phones back in those days to text. They didn't have computers and games to play. They actually had to use their intellect, their creativity, something, Wyatt, that kids your age have never had to venture into.
Yep. By the way, you're completely wrong with the Frisbee thing.
Okay, go ahead.
They were invented in the 30s.
Oh!
And because the inventor, Walter Frederick Morrison, and his future wife had fun tossing a popcorn can lid after a Thanksgiving Day dinner in 1937. And after that, they just decided, what if we just literally sold people cake pans? The original Frisbee doubled as a baking implement. Who knew?
So you're saying the entire Frisbee pie pan scenario is completely false?
Yeah, I've absolutely no idea where you got that story from.
Okay. Well, the good news is, if you haven't learned, the internet is filled with fake news, and you have no response.
You want me to find another source then?
I'm telling you, that's what I read because I found it interesting and fascinating. So perhaps, what was the source you discovered your version, the popcorn tin of the 30s, that a husband and wife, what do you think the odds are a husband and wife in the 30s are outside throwing a tin top back and forth to each? Does that sound right to you?
Why wouldn't it be right?
Anyways, Wyatt, I got to ask you about the 70s. So when you think about your life and living your life and so forth, you watch movies or you see retro games. You're a big gamer, right? And so do you ever think about, like, I guess you can't not think about the 60s and the 50s. Back in the 70s, they had a sitcom called Happy Days. And Happy Days was about the 50s. Now, I wasn't around in the 50s. My parents were. And so it was a whole reminiscent nostalgia of living in the 50s and the innocent age. And then the 60s, of course, was the hippies and the destruction of America, and probably the worst decade in our history for destroying our freedoms and our moral values, for sure. But do you ever think of a decade that you're like, man, that would have been fun if I could like choose a decade to go visit? What would you choose, Wyatt? And by the way, this is my Mighty 10,000 mug, which you can get if you go to bradstine.com and join the Mighty 10,000. $3 a month subscription, and pretty soon you're going to be able to get the full episode of Wyatt and I talking, as well as my rants and full episodes of our guests who is about to come on, Dean Batali. So I just wanted to take a moment and let you know about that. Wyatt, go ahead. The decade you most long for.
That is a good question, because the 80s had disco. The 90s wasn't disco?
70s was disco.
Really?
Yeah.
What was 80s then?
80s was techno pop, like
Ew.
Devo and that kind of tech. They were just getting into, I think, electronic stuff. So yeah, now I'm reconsidering your insight into the Frisbee dilemma, because I'm guessing you don't really know what you're talking about.
Well,
son.
look.
If you thought the 80s was disco when it was in fact the 70s.
Well,
now there might have been some crossover for the first year or two, but it really went sideways. The Bee Gees took a big hit when they started going disco, and everybody said, "What have you done?" And they mocked. They were huge when they did the album Saturday Night Fever. They got as big as they can get, and then suddenly everybody decided that disco was out, and so they threw those babies out with the bathwater, and that bathwater was at 80 degrees, if you know what I'm getting.
Okay, but I know the 90s was grunge, right? Yeah, I got that one at least.
Yes.
So that'd be a good one. 70's had a TV show. I forget the name of it, but I'm sure it's important.
Yeah, I don't remember.
The 60's had the Beatles.
That's true.
The early, like the cut and dry, pre them all dying and overtiring Beatles.
Well, they're not all dead, Wyatt. There's two left of the
I
four.
know, dying and overtiring.
Yeah.
I specifically made sure to say that.
I will give credit. As you know, the drummers are usually the first to go, and I think that was immortalized in Spinal Tap.
Oh, absolutely.
But Ringo has hung on for dear life. Why, even Charlie Watts has passed and Neil Peart has passed. But Ringo has hung on for dear life. Now, you're a drummer. Are you familiar with Ringo's drumming prowess?
Absolutely, yes.
Now, here's what and who's to say? You know, when you first heard the Beatles and there was nothing like that, it had to blow people's mind. Okay, I get all that. But I've heard a lot of drummers, I mean, very profound, well-known drummers, talk about Ringo Starr as their influence. Now, what I think to myself is, was he an influence because they were first hearing about rock and roll of this caliber and they heard his grooves and are like, oh my gosh, and they've never played, so this is as amazing as it gets? Or did he do something that stood out? Because he's not flashy at all. But you know what? Either was Charlie Watts, and he was with one of maybe the most successful rock band of all time, the Rolling Stones. They're up there with the top three anyways. So what do you think about the chops of Ringo Starr?
I believe my favorite quote by the Beatles, I forget, I think it was Paul who said it. He was asked by a reporter if Ringo was the best drummer in the world. And his response was simply, Ringo isn't the best drummer in the Beatles.
That sounds like something John would say.
But, maybe.
But
yeah, I mean, he did some good stuff, but he actually, there is a little bit of controversy to some of this recording stuff.
Please.
I forget what the song was, but early recording sessions, it's been claimed that a session drummer, I think Andy White, or maybe he was the one who actually did, but there has been claims that a session drummer actually recorded some of their albums instead of Ringo.
Well, are you sure that wasn't when they were getting rid of Pete Best?
No. This was like to this day, in fact.
So when I saw this whole thing of all these drummers talking about this incredible chops of Ringo Starr, they were just making that up. And part of what and I've heard Ringo talk about this, he was lefty. He was left-handed. So the way the drum kit works is for right-handed people. So he had to cross over and do weird things because of his left-handedness, which ended up making for, just by accident, interesting sounds because a lefty trying to play a right-handed drum kit. Does that make any sense, or are we just making stuff up on the fly?
I mean, whatever you want to say, he definitely plays the drums.
Okay.
That's about all I can say for certain.
So you're not a fan?
So it's been described that his technique was more about groove rather than actual technical prowess or chops, and I can definitely attest to that. You can easily tell that if you actually listen to his stuff. He isn't playing anything complex.
I said.
Yeah, he's just playing stuff that fits the feel of the song.
Wyatt?
Yeah?
What else would you be hired to do than to make your drum part perfectly fit the song? Maybe a complex guy, a Keith Moon trying to do it, would just add all kinds of crazy, and maybe simplicity, as they once said, less is more. Maybe that's what made it so perfect, because there was cool things like Come Together with that. I mean, it was a cool little move. Simple, but very tasty. Wyatt, come on. You don't have any grooves of his that you can appreciate as a drummer?
Oh, no, I appreciate the grooves like that. It's just,
You don't.
I could do that.
Well,
It's not hard.
nobody
Honestly,
was
it's
claiming
not hard.
he was doing impossible things.
No, but like, well, I don't just mean impossible things in terms of technique. I mean in terms of groove. He's
Yeah.
not doing anything especially special.
Even if it was in the 60s and it was kind of like innovative then, and now you're so used to it because so many people copied it that you've lost what it would have felt like if you'd heard it for the first time.
I mean, that's always a possibility, and there's no way for us to know that for certain.
I know it.
Really?
I know it for certain.
You know that for certain?
You know why?
Please, enlighten me.
Because I lived that 70s show. I lived there. I was in Southern California in the 70s, and I watched life change from just a surfing boy minding his own business, playing some baseball, collecting baseball cards, not knowing what his life was going to become, not knowing he was going to become a professional magician, a professional comedian, professional actor. Who could know what your life is going to give you when you're a youngin'? But I was there, and I lived that 70s. And the guy that we are about to talk to right now, Dean Batali, he got together with me and my late manager, Mike Smith, God bless his soul. And we put together a pitch for a sitcom where I was going to be a conservative guy surrounded by left-leaning wife, and we lived in Boulder, Colorado, and everything. Basically, what Tim Allen ended up selling, The Last Man Standing, was our pitch. And so it was in the same vein, but of course they just weren't going to give it to me, but it was in the ballpark. But this guy's got quite an accomplished career. He was a showrunner for one season, if I'm not mistaken, for that 70s show. He actually ran the show, put all the pieces together, made it all happen, wrote on it, and some other places, which you're going to hear about as you watch, some very well-known other shows that were in that era that he was a head writer on and participant in. And the whole point is what? He was and is a Christian, a Christ follower, and wanted to not compromise his faith, but work in this very dangerous, dark industry known as Hollywood. And so we're going to talk to him about how he navigated it, how others who are believers that might want to get into that world, is this safe? Is it safe? Or is the landmines too precarious? This remains to be seen. But for those of you who are interested in screenwriting and or producing and or creating incredible television, this is going to be an interview you're not going to want to miss or listen to. So, without further ado, unless I've already adoed to further, please welcome me and my guest this week, screenwriter and line producer for that 70s show at one time, Dean Batali. Well, you guys are so fortunate to be on Brad Stine Has Issues. I wish I was on Brad Stine Has Issues, but I have to actually be the guy that talks about things instead of being able to observe and watch and enjoy. I have to be the face of this franchise. I don't know why. It's the cross I have to bear. But I will say this, being as I love to have eclectic guests and love to have especially the performing arts represented, since that's a world I've inhabited for a long time, it's always fun to get people from all angles of this beautiful, amazing communication form of entertainment and or infotainment that we have seen throughout the social media world and, of course, on what we used to think of as just regular television and so forth. And this particular gentleman is one who's been very much involved in that at the highest levels, believe it or not. And he also happens to be uniquely a friend of mine. I don't know why. I think that it could be a penance. If you believe in that, he might be serving some kind of court order. I don't know. That's going to be him to elucidate to us if he can. I'm sure he can, because he's a writer and he's a producer and was a showrunner and also was involved in a show that I was trying to do years ago, until they found out I was a Christian and conservative. And then that had to come to a screaming halt. This is Hollywood. But he is a good man. He's a very smart and successful producer and writer in Hollywood. And this is the hard part to digest, he's a Christ follower. So how has he pulled off the impossible? I'm going to let him tell you. So, welcome to Brad Stine Has Issues. Dean Batali, how do you do, old friend?
Yeah, we it was kind of an arranged marriage at the time, if I recall. We were brought together by your manager, maybe, who
Yeah.
kind of put out the word that you were looking for writers.
Yep,
Uh,
that's right. Yeah, yeah. Well, for sure, it was arranged marriage, but I don't know how you would have come
yeah,
in. I mean, who would have he have talked to even
I
have
think,
access? Because I know I would have wanted a Christian, but
yeah,
yet I would have wanted one that had enough savvy to be able to navigate the true Hollywood.
yeah. And this was soon after that 70's show, because I was a writer on that 70's show. We can talk about that. But I remember that article. It was about you. And who were you with UTA at the time, or management, or?
Maybe William Morris.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. They might have just kind of put out a call. We're looking for writers. This is the comedian. My agent probably saw, whether or not you were looking for a Christian writer or
Yeah.
not, as word about you got out. Boy, gosh. And now that I think of it, I might have actually reached out to your guys and said, hey, this guy looks interesting. Anyway,
Yeah, I
however
don't
it
know.
happened,
I
they were
mean, it would have
suddenly,
been around 2004-ish, so it would have
yeah,
been almost 25 years ago. So, I mean, who knows? But
yeah.
it was a great experience. That will probably show up in this interview somewhere eventually, because it was a fun little momentary ride that we were sort of all excited about and came to a crashing halt, as do most projects.
As
And
do
that's not
most
just,
things.
yeah.
It's so normal. I tell people when I tell young writers, think of all the job interviews you went on and didn't get, or every date you wanted to go on, or every time you didn't get picked for the team, and multiply that kind of rejection times every single day, because that's what Hollywood is.
Isn't that the truth? And I remember somebody telling me years ago, Dean, that virtually every time a studio exec or whomever's in charge of let's say new projects
Yeah.
is approached or pitched, virtually every time they say no. And the reason why they say no is because if they say no, they can't get fired because they didn't make the wrong call. They didn't choose the project that ended up tanking, costing them money, loss of reputation, who knows? But anyways, the moment you say yes, the moment you green light something, you're responsible for it. You're responsible for the money that has just been allocated to that project. You're responsible for the talent that is acquired or not. You're responsible for how the people perceive this project, if they like it, if they don't. And if it eats it, then it's on you. So it's easier to say no and keep your job. Now, I don't know if that is a little simplistic, but that's what I was taught. What do you
Yeah,
think?
it's a generalization, and it's not untrue. A lot of Hollywood is run on fear. There's a lot of money, a lot of, reputation, and it's easier to say no than to say yes. So, and it's easier to just kind of go with what already works. It's why so many sequels happen. It's why so many reboots of TV shows are happening. And so when you go out there with something brand new, especially something brand new that Hollywood has never heard of, or an audience they don't really understand, which we'll talk about, or
Mm.
a comedian like you that was, it was and is really successful. And at that time, there was so much heat on you because of an article. I think that was the article that called you God's comic
In
for
the
the
New
first time.
Yorker. In the New
Yeah, yeah.
Yorker. Yeah.
And it's like they read the New Yorker, but they go, "Who is this guy? And what are these states that he's performing in? And it's so popular. I've
Yeah.
never heard of these southern states. I've
Yeah.
never been to any of them." So it becomes a little of that, and it's frustrating to try to get them to really open up. By the way, I wanted to say I have the same artwork on my walls that you have on yours, but I just can't see. I just like Brad Stine looking at me in both
Oh,
cartoon
yeah.
form and sort of Ronald Reagan form looking over my.
Yes, indeed.
It's on the
Yes.
other wall, but
Well, I like to think of it as systemic narcissism.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's really the
It's
way.
understood. I understood. I
Yeah.
spent enough time with you to know.
Yes,
You
indeed.
traveled around with both photos, so you could just point to whichever emotion you were feeling.
Or whatever moment in my career that I was in angst is immortalized, because it is, in fact, it's funny you bring that up, but it actually has remnants of my life, my career. That the one right over my shoulder here
Yeah.
is a 19-year-old magician in Newport Beach, California, in his first job as a close-up magician, starting my career in the performing arts that I would have never known was going to become my life.
Because you did magic
I
early
did.
on,
I was
right?
a magician and a professional in Southern California, where you live, or at least California. I'm not sure where you are
Yeah.
now,
I
but
still, yeah, I'm right near Pasadena, north of Hollywood.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but anyways, that's where I started. Poppy's Star was the name of the restaurant. I say that because I think there was one in Pasadena. Actually, I think that's why I'm bringing that up. But anyways, that's kind of where I started, and then over my other shoulder is a guy that made me a little bit of I guess a trademark look. His name was
Yeah.
Dave Arkell, who did caricatures, but he did them realistically, more like
Yeah.
Mad Magazine
Yeah.
style. I bring him up because he ended up going into storyboarding for studios and or directors. So that was that part. And then let's see, the one over, I'm always doing it wrong. That guy ends up being by a professional artist from Russia who did that with a pencil sketch, and then the one over here was some other guy. Anyways, it just was something I threw up there just to. I'll tell you why, because it's my show, Dean. I can
Hey,
do whatever I want.
you
That's
can
why.
do whatever you want. And we have to stare at you every time we watch, and we should stare at three or four of you because we're
Amen.
volunteering.
And the one in the middle is the
That's right.
guy still trying to find the brass ring in Hollywood that I think has long passed
I
me by.
I remember the joke that I thought really defined you, which you may still do, but it was I'm a Christian conservative comedian, which is why on my tombstone it'll say never had a sitcom.
Yeah, right.
That was a perfect joke at the time that really defined you. Always looking for the jokes that define a comedian, their point of view. And I was meeting with, I can't say a lot of comedians, but at the time, this is the, early 2000s when Everybody Loves Raymond was on and Seinfeld was over, but they're all, Roseanne, I guess, was off, but they were still looking for comedians. King of Queens,
Yeah.
everybody looking for comedians to build shows around. Grace Under Fire, those kind of things. Reba wasn't a
Well,
comedian.
it's funny. It's funny too, Dean, because um, boy, it's hard to really evaluate what's going on in that world because on one hand, to be kind of um, I guess transparent or even objective about myself, always hard to do, to be
Yeah,
objective about yourself. It's easy to find a scapegoat. Well, of course they didn't want me. I'm a Christian and I'm not apologizing. Well, of course I'm a conservative. And that I'm not going to pretend that doesn't have a piece of the
yeah,
puzzle. But the truth of the matter is the sitcom that you helped develop that we pitched to Hollywood
yeah,
ended up being made with Tim Allen. It was just a whole, and I'm not saying he stole it. I'm just
yeah,
saying
yeah, yeah.
his I think
The
it was called well, it's not the tool time or whatever it was or
Yeah.
whatever. The
Last
second
Man
one,
Standing. Last
that's
Man
it.
Standing.
Last Man
Yeah.
Standing was essentially
Very
what we
similar.
pitched.
Right.
It
Guy
was
with
a
that worldview kind of up against the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
One conservative amongst everybody who he loves, who happens to
Right.
have an antithetical viewpoint, and trying to navigate that uh, while being civil and kind and loving to people that he cares about. And that's
It's
what we were
also,
pitching.
yeah. And it's also, I mean, there was a lot going on. Like, I remember I went and saw you at some stadium in Arizona.
Mm.
I don't think it was a Promise Keepers, but it was a men's event. It was
No, it
mostly
would have been Promise Keepers.
But yeah. And so, I'm not going to get any Hollywood producers to come to that event and see you there, right? They're going to feel so out of place and not understand it. And they're
Yeah.
not like wide thinking enough to go, oh, there's a huge audience here. So, yeah, that became a part of it. I think it's a lot of pieces. It was hard to get people to understand your audience because simply Hollywood executives don't know a lot of Christians. They don't hang out with them. And Hollywood just tends to be very insular and they want to get complimented by the people they're working with. They want to say, oh, I love that show you put on the air. And so there's this weird thing going on of, well, if I greenlight, nobody I watch is going to watch that show. So why
Yeah.
would I put that? So that becomes a little self-fulfilling. They can't really think wide enough. And yeah, and whether or not we had the right show or not, but it was hard to get people to understand
Yeah.
your appeal that
Yeah.
you have such a large audience within this different lane that they understood. And so there's
Well,
a
for
lot
sure,
of that.
for sure. But I think that kind of harkens back to my original premise in that it's easier to say no than to
Absolutely.
say yes and then have to be responsible for whatever transpires. And the truth is, um, Gee, I don't know, Dean. I don't know if a studio head or whatever the particular uh, uh, whatever the moniker is of those who
Yeah.
are acquiring new projects
Yeah.
are, but eventually gets to the studio head. But either way, whoever that person is, I mean, let's be honest, if they don't understand what they're trying to put together, they're probably not going to do it. It's like I don't even know what we're making. It doesn't
Well,
connect to me, and so it doesn't
yeah.
make sense. But the thing I remember, Dean, and I don't know if you were at this pitch. I think you would have been, but it was a young woman, would have been a CBS and then one of the major networks at that
Yeah.
time. But it was
Yeah.
a young girl who,
Yeah.
and I've come to find out later, and you would know this much more than me, that oftentimes these conduits to the head honcho that's going to say yes or no used to be the secretary, and then it used to. I mean, literally, I don't know how they come up the ranks, but she might have been a mid-20s girl, nothing wrong with that, but they certainly have a very particular perspective.
Yeah.
And certainly if they are left leaning,
Yeah.
we made our pitch.
Yeah.
And I remember her response, well, you certainly have a point of view, don't you?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And I could tell in the way she was saying that was basically the undercurrent of what she wasn't saying was, and it ain't mine.
Yeah.
Because we were saying, what about one concern? And we would say this specifically, Dean. It's not a conservative show. It's not a Christian show. It's just one guy
Yeah.
represents this giant demographic of Americans who are
Yeah.
not forget underrepresented, not represented, and yet we're going to put around them progressives or
Yeah.
liberals or whatever we were calling it at that time.
You
So
wanted
that
George Carlin as your dad, who was George
yeah,
Carlin was
yeah, yeah.
alive at
It'll
the
be
time.
fun. It'll be fun. Everybody's got a point. All we're saying with me is we're just adding one more representative of an America so that everybody can laugh at everybody. That was the premise. That sounds as reasonable as it could be. But man, my friend, let's be honest. It is difficult to overcome your presuppositional
Yeah.
worldview, your religious affiliation, your philosophical affiliation, and in Hollywood, your political affiliation, which represents and let's say substitutes their religious belief, is their political belief. It literally becomes their version of where ethics, morals, virtue comes from. And so they can't escape that. That's their grid. And if you are outside of that grid, not only do they not understand it, they're not going to what we now call platform you. I'm not giving you a voice at the table because it's Nazis, it's evil, it's dark. Now, I don't think they were saying it to that extreme then, but keep in mind that when that article came out in New York in 2004, it was the Bush Kerry day. They
Right. Yeah.
hated Bush like they
Yeah.
hated Trump, but didn't have the social media access to attack like they did with Trump. But they hated that man. And so to think that I was an associate of him, this wasn't even a consideration. No, but my friend, we're not giving you access to the table of ideas because you're not just in disagreement. You're evil, and that's truly how they see things.
You used to have one late night show or two late night shows and one sketch comedy show. And so all the great writers would be writing on that show. Now you have 5 or 6 late night shows. So the writing is actually not as good as it used to be. Jim Burrows, or no, I think it's yeah, Jim Burrows said, in 1995 when there were, in 19 Lauren Michaels says there's only 1,000 funny people in the world at any given time. 1,000 funny people. Jim Burrows says there's only 100 funny comedy writers at any given time. And so now we're kind of, things are kind of getting thinned out. And as people go in different directions and create different kind of shows, the challenge is how can Christians and people right of center get into the culture, get our voice heard in the culture? How do we be wise? Look, I think we need more people with our beliefs in Hollywood. But also, if you want to go and build your own thing, I mean, there are these other companies, some of them I mentioned before. I have no problem with that, as long as we do it really well, as long as we become really competitive, and so that the world can look at us and go, wow, that's really good art. That's funny. Those are good shows happening out
Well,
there.
let me kind of jump off of that because there is something. I mean, we've had a wonderful conversation. We can keep going as long as you're not up against any hard stop. But I do want to say this: I don't want to lose the fact or the opportunity for my people, my fans that listen and watch this, to also get to know you, and also, frankly, Dean, what you've accomplished, because it isn't any small feat to have done be a showrunner, for example, is a big deal, and you did that once on a very successful sitcom, which is a big deal. And you're a Christian, and it was not a Christian show. So I want to show people, just in case you don't know Dean or know the name. And oftentimes, as a writer producer, people don't. They don't know who that. They just care about the actors and the dialogue. But this man is a writer producer on that 70s show, which most people have heard or remember. I mean, we're getting at an age where they go. Some kids are going,
I
"Who?
know.
What was
Remember,
that?" And you're going,
that show premiered last century, and so did Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I wrote on. So whenever I'm talking to younger people, it's like these are shows your parents might have watched.
Right, I know, and we're at that age. But here's what I wanted people to know. So you were either a writer or a producer or a showrunner or maybe executive producer. I don't know all of your accolades, um, or some combination of that on that 70s show, which if you don't know it, look it up. It was very popular for a long time. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, very popular, very successful show. Sabrina, Secrets of a Teenage Witch,
I
and
keep
Good
writing for
Witch.
witches. Crazy,
So
crazy. Yeah.
I sense a theme here, Dean, that apparently when Hollywood wants to get the best writer, producer, showrunner, advocate for witches and vampires,
Uh,
get a Christian.
yeah.
So I need to. So I'm joking with you, but I do find it interesting that you end up in
You
these
know,
sort of.
after I also I had a job offer to work on Charmed, the first season of Charmed. This was after Buffy, which was completely about witches, just like I didn't
Yeah.
want to do that. And weirdly enough, Good Witch, which on Hallmark was probably the most wholesome show I ever worked on. The rules of that show were so much about community and goodness and fruit of the spirit. In Hollywood, you kind of get pigeonholed into what you've done before.
Oh
So
yeah.
I've written a lot of pilots, and I ran another show in Canada called What's Up Warthogs, which was a teenage show. I go out on a lot of meetings for. I wrote a pilot that they wanted to be Buffy meets Smallville. This was after I had. This was for ABC Family at the time. It's now Freeform. So I kind of got in that vein, supernatural shows and shows about teenagers. Not really what I wanted. I'm much more interested in family dramas, adult dramas, really kind of more interested in hour-long shows and half-hour shows. And I and what's weird is I came to Hollywood because I got fired from a Christian theater company. I started out as a playwright. I become a playwright again. I have a play called Lewis and Tolkien, which just had a production in Seattle, premiered in Hollywood a couple years ago. It's going to be at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. in October of
Nice.
2025. So anybody in the area, check it out. But I've struggled with what kinds of shows God has put me on, and I could have said no. I could have refused to go to these places, and I often get, I get similar kind of criticism you sometimes get is what's a Christian doing going into these comedy clubs? My feeling is, yes, I think there are places Christians should not be, but we got to kind of go where the dirty work is being done and try to make it less damaging. I'll actually freely admit that some of the shows I've worked on has been damaging to our culture, but I feel as a Christian there, I could make it less damaging. I always tell this story is that we're called to be salt and light, and salt changes the flavor, yes, but sometimes all salt done to stop the decay of something. So if you have two pieces of steak and put salt on one and no salt on the other, come back in 4 or 5 days, both of those pieces of meat are going to be rancid, but the one that had salt on it is going to be less rancid than the other one, right? And that's what Christians can do. So none of my episodes of that 70s show are going to be shown in churches, although I did get discussions of God on the show, discussions about Jesus. Had a Christian character who we was kind of made fun of, but then redeemed. Tried to do that on Good Witch as well.
Now,
Wasn't able to
do
Buffy.
they notice though when you're doing that? I mean, did they kind of
So,
go, well, this is so out of left field. Like, what are you doing? What is this
so
all?
the writers on the show, I became known on that 70s show as the guy who could make any dirty joke clean. And then when we actually were trying, yeah, the writers noticed, and again, whether they thought I had an agenda or not, if it was funny, it worked. So I wanted to do a show about how one of the characters decides he doesn't want to go to church anymore. Somebody else pitched a really wacky kind of 70s style youth pastor who we made fun of for a bunch of episodes, but then eventually redeemed. We did an episode about them doing a church play and how all the noise, so we were in a church doing the nativity. Yeah, the writers kind of would glance at me if they felt I was getting too agenda driven, just as they'd glance at the two gay guys if they felt they were getting too agenda driven. So again, you got to be able to put up with it. I have been on, they didn't notice on Goodwitch. I also put some very subtle small government jokes into Goodwitch about taxes and bureaucracy that the network didn't really notice. Because
Well,
again, it's my job to do the show that they
yeah, yeah.
have,
Well,
but
it
my
is. And
worldview starts to creep in. But I couldn't
okay,
put any.
okay, but this is an important maybe moment of insight here for people listening who I've had numerous actors and different types of performance arts or whatnot on the show. And so, but I don't know that I've ever had you were a showrunner maybe with
Yeah.
70s show
The
once or
final
what?
season of 70 show, I was the showrunner, and
Okay,
then
so
I
first
showrunner.
off, for those who maybe don't know the nomenclature, what I mean, that's very huge responsibility. But
Yeah.
explain to people what if you're a showrunner, what does that mean?
Yeah. So your title is executive producer, even though TV shows can have a bunch of different executive producers. But a showrunner is the head writer and also in charge of casting and is the boss of the director. The director generally has to look at you before he and she can move on. So on the Dick Van Dyke show, Dick Van Dyke was essentially the showrunner, the head writer. On 30 Rock, Tina Fey was exactly the showrunner, the executive producer. On a show like Goodwitch, that means that every word that eventually hit the screen was mine because I'm the one who's helping come up with all the stories, overseeing the outlines, and rewriting the scripts that the other writers. We generally have a staff of 4 or 5 different writers. So you're head writer, but also in charge of costumes. You're making. Ricky Gervais says being a showrunner is like being on a quiz show where every answer you say is right because the costume designer says you want the red one or the green one. You say green, and then you're doing the stories that you want to do. The network has to approve your stories. So
Yeah.
Hallmark had to approve my stories, Fox had to approve my stories. But
Yeah.
generally, you're the voice of the show. So if you're creating the show, it can become very much your worldview. The characters that are
Yeah.
on the show very much were. I've never created a show that I show ran, but I was trying to get, like I say, the characters on Goodwitch. When I took over the show, there were these two women who were just always fighting, and I didn't want to do a show about women fighting. I wanted to do a show about women who demonstrated forgiveness and grace to one another. I didn't use those terms, but that's what I did. So that's how one Christian's worldview can be that driving force.
Well, I really find that interesting because I think that's really kind of the direction I was heading with this with this particular moment of conversation. Because let's face it, uh, acting, films, and so forth along that line for Christians, there is always this moment of truth where you have to figure, I can't escape my body. I can't escape
Yeah,
who I really am in real time. Because when I was in Hollywood in acting
yeah,
class
yeah,
and I was doing the things and trying to learn the craft of acting,
yeah.
the thing you have to learn if you're a great actor, not that I am, I'm just saying, but if that's what you're shooting for, you literally have to become a disposable artifact
Yeah.
that your body is used to become whatever that character is. And if that character rapes, then so be it. If that character murders, then so be it. If that character takes the Lord's name in vain, do it with gusto. In other words, you aren't you. You become whatever the writer and the producer and the director has decided you are. You facilitate the story, the end. And if you can't get out of the way of yourself, then you shouldn't be in this business. But the problem is, I'm a Christian. In the end, if I'm kissing a woman that isn't my wife, I'm kissing a woman that is my wife, even though his name was Ted and he's a longshoreman. Well, yeah, but it's still my body he's using for this moment. So I found myself struggling with, man, I don't know if I can do this because I don't think I want to be this guy. And it's really what caused me to focus on faith-based films because I said, you know what, in the end, I think I can justify playing a bad guy, and I played a bunch of heavies and faith-based because they exist.
Yeah.
As long as the bad guy loses, as long as it's a redemptive story, then that's a God
And
story. And
what
I'm
is the entire show adding up to? You know, I talk about Les Miserables. If you're a woman in Les Miserables, you're gonna most likely play a prostitute because there are a lot of prostitutes there. But the entirety of the show is about grace and God. But again, everybody kind of, I, I'm asking people to understand the struggle that, you know, did I have to compromise to work on that 70s show? I don't know. We have to define what compromise did. Did Daniel compromise when he was serving in Nebuchadnezzar's court? Well, if Daniel didn't do what he was told, he would have been killed. So that might be a little different. But he was doing things, he was messing it up
yeah.
with a lot of people, you know, the astrologers and the soothsayers who God had said in Deuteronomy to have nothing to do with. So I just think that God kind of strengthens each of us to do the things. I think your example is a really good one, that he also equips each of us to do kind of different things. I can't compare arts to the military, but in the military, you have some people on the front line, you have some people handing weapons off, you have some people sewing the uniforms. And God is going to place us on this cultural field in different places. I think that we need to figure out how to equip Christians to get more involved in mainstream culture. However, we also have to make our subcultural lane, faith films, TV for us, better, stronger, so that the world looks at us and goes, hey, that show is really good. That show is really funny. That comedian's really funny. But what you say is absolutely right. You know, actors who have to go through the emotions, writers, there have been shows that I've turned down. I turned down Charmed. I turned down a chance to work on Dexter because I just thought it was going to be pornographic about serial killing. But then eventually that show kind of turned into a show about justice and mercy and even touched on issues of faith. So I don't know. I don't know. But
Yeah, but let's just sort of think that through. And I know you trust my heart. It's not an indictment against you. It
yeah,
literally is saying,
yeah,
let's help us all understand how challenging this is.
yeah,
Because um uh yeah, Daniel, was forced to
that's
be
right.
part of
Yeah,
Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, there's a
that's
difference
right.
between being part of a totalitarian
Absolutely right.
regime and you're a Christian and you're trying to navigate it and be
That's
a
right.
good citizen, and a guy in his business
Yeah,
deciding what you just said. I
yeah,
said no, which you could have used the money. I'm sure you would have loved to have that on your bio.
yeah, yeah.
Dexter, I worked with James Reamer, actually, who would play
Oh yeah,
Dexter's dad. I was in a movie with him. So that was a moment where you made a moral
that's right.
choice based
Yeah,
on it. But on the other hand, I'm guarantee if somebody's listening or watching who's a Christ follower and is old enough to know that somebody shows he's going, if he's a legalist, he's going, dude, there's no way you
yeah.
can
I always
justify.
I always struggle with this conversation because it's like there's always that stripper who says I'm stripping for Christ, you know.
Right.
So I was, yeah, no, and I don't mind the pushback. It's complicated and it's hard. And I remember going like when after 5 years, when I was considering whether to re-up for another 2 years on that 70 show and praying about it a lot and had friends praying about it. And I came to realize if I leave this chair, the person who replaces me is not going to be a Christian. So I've got this place in this room. So I felt I needed to stay there. And I always say this too, the Parents Television Council used to rate that 70 show as one of the worst three shows on television in terms of content and sexual behavior and drug use. And my argument is if I hadn't been there, we would have been number one
Mm.
because that's what one Christian can do in the room. Now, are there places we shouldn't go? Yes, I don't think Christians should be making pornography that is less pornographic or more Christian, right? I do think there are limits. And I understand the people who think, I think that's kind of messy that you were in that room. But now almost every show that I know where there's a Christian, there's at least two Christians in that room. Because now
Mm.
there are more Christian writers out there, and God is kind of there was a show called The Playboy Club years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. It only went one season, was right on when Mad Men was on. God, in his wisdom, put three different Christian writers on that show. Imagine, and one of them in the room when he was being interviewed said, I don't think I'm right for the show. I'm a Christian. And the showrunner said, well, actually, I want your point of view because I want to get into the morality of this. So I'm not saying that show should have succeeded and maybe all the
Yeah.
Playboy would have become Christians. It is messy, and you
Yeah,
should push
it
back
is.
against those of us who hear, but understand that there is a community of Christians in Hollywood. who are striving to represent ourselves so that people know who we are. I'm pitching a show this week about Christian characters and just kind of explaining Christians just want to see ourselves represented on screen. In this era of representation, we were talking about how different kind of mindsets and different kind of people got their voices heard in Hollywood. Christians need to be represented. Where are the representations of Christian believers
Well,
on
of course,
television?
yeah, and and here's the other problem is what you said a while ago was, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I mean, because we're believers, we believe in a dark realm. There is a fight that is spiritual that doesn't want us represented. They don't want redemption put into a place that they control. Hey, no, let's keep it with the sex and drugs because I can control people. So there is a true battle, and I think of Christian actors. I think of a Denzel Washington. I mean, who knows? I just know what they claim to be. I'm not here to judge
Yeah,
them,
yeah,
but you got this amazing actor,
yeah.
clearly Denzel Washington. You have Matthew McConaughey, I think, different guys. Jim Caviezel. So they have it written in their contract. I won't do a sex scene. I will not do. I think Jim Caviezel was Jennifer Lopez and him did a movie years ago, and there was a sexual moment, and she wanted to be naked in it to be realistic. He said, "I'm not going to do it. I'm married." But meanwhile, they'll cuss up a storm. They'll use any kind of language. They'll use, "I'll kill, I'll murder, I'll say, Jesus Christ in a pejorative, whatever." And they've they've I don't want to say justified it because it sounds like I'm talking about a compromise. I think
Yeah.
somehow they've come to a conclusion that God has said yes on this one. And so can we just make a blanket statement? I'm sorry, you don't get to make that call. I'm a fellow Christ follower. I have to assess your fruit. I think you're just really trying to give yourself permission to do something. First off, do we have the right to even bring that to their attention? And B, because you're in it, you did it. Is there something to be said for, listen, maybe God has said it's I don't care
Yeah.
that you're doing that
So
word because I know that you witnessed to the grip who became a believer and you witnessed to the AD who became a believer. And I mean, I don't know, man. I mean,
first of all, you have the right to challenge me because we have a relationship. So yes, you
and
can.
I'm not challenging
No,
you.
no,
I'm
no.
literally trying to figure
But
out.
that's what I'm saying. It's like judge not lest you be judged doesn't mean we can't evaluate people or be on a jury. So I think that this is part of the conversation, and that I want to just tell people that most of the people I know in Hollywood struggle with these kinds of things regularly because yeah, I have a huge problem with Jesus as a swear word, but nearly every writer I know, I shouldn't say every, but many use Jesus swear words so it shows up in movies and films and TV because they just think everybody does that. What are I think that, and I think we should challenge each other. And by the way, I do think there are places Christians should not go. I'm just not ready to say Hollywood is that place yet. Should Christians create there are Christian schools out there that are training filmmakers and saying, don't go to Hollywood, just work in the independent film realm or independent TV space. I get it. I understand it. But that leaves Nineveh completely
Yeah,
unsaved,
yeah.
right? That's kind of my feeling about Hollywood
I
is
guess I wanted to make sure, and again, this is all conjecture because, everybody has an individual journey. Uh, and again, we know each other. I know your heart. I'm not even, I'm literally just trying to understand why it's
yeah,
so sticky for us to try to figure out. But the
yeah,
truth of the matter is, we we can use our liberty
right.
in Christ to give ourselves permission to do something that we kind of
That's right.
know isn't accurate.
Absolutely.
We're taking license for something that we know this can't be godly thing, and we want a job, and we
Yeah.
want to make some money, and we want to do this. And here's the thing, Dean. You know, if I feel like I'm skilled at screenwriting or as an actor, and I just want to do this thing, um, you know, is that God that gave me this artistic acumen? Is that the Lord that sort of said, "I have this call for you"? And yeah, you're going to Nineveh. You're going to Sodom and Gomorrah, buddy, because guess what? There was a righteous man there.
That's right.
There was a
Yeah.
righteous man
At
there.
least for a day. Yeah.
So I am not trying to take any kind of
No, I
A
love this
compromise.
conversation. I love that.
I just want people to Christians to be honest enough to know, you know, it just isn't that easy. And maybe what God is saying is, and I've noticed this in the Bible, he talked about this idea of if you the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So you go worship as you want. If you want to eat this food, I've sanctified everything. All things are lawful now. Not all things are expedient. So there seems to be this odd, I think, misapproached concept in the Bible that I love, but it's really interesting. Is he says, listen, if you have grace and liberty in this space, so be it. If you think it's a sin, though, this guy over here, if you think it's a sin, then don't do it. You get to make that choice. But here's the weird part. He says, and if you go ahead and indulge in this thing that you have decided is a sin, it's a sin now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Meanwhile, the guy here that never thought it was, you're cool. That it's almost like God has given us this very delicate, fragile, responsibility that sometimes, Dean, Christians are going to get to the same crossroad, make two different choices, and God redeems and sanctifies both of them based on your particular call that might be uniquely specific to you. It's dangerous. You can easily get caught up in that dark world that will suck you down. I've seen it happen with Miley Cyrus and Kate Hudson, who became Katy Perry. So many Christians that tried first to be there, and then they went to the world, and the world sucked them, and they have lost their way. So I'm not saying this is an easy road, but it is possible. You were called to Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's going to be rough, but you get to go there. And trying to find that truth is the challenge of challenges.
I hate to say this because I know who I'm talking to and how this is going to affect you, but that's really well said.
Oh, come on.
I know. Now you're going to live off of the compliment.
Oh, for crying now.
I know. Now you're going to have another drawing over your head of you looking very pensive.
But obviously I've grappled with this.
That's right. And here's two quick responses. One of them is that Daniel and the others who were kidnapped, when they were told to eat the food that was dedicated to other gods, said, we're going to do it differently. They didn't say we're not going to do. They didn't go on a hunger strike. They said, we're just not going to eat that food. So the challenge is, how can Christians do it slightly differently, right? And the other thing is that you and I, as writers, you're in front of the camera, and then actors really have a different kind of challenge and are a little more open to judgment. And I think we have to be more open to challenges. That I do understand the people who don't understand what's a Christian doing in comedy, what's a Christian doing, in order for Mel Gibson to get the money to do The Passion of the Christ, he had to drop a lot of F-bombs when he agreed to do Lethal Weapon 3, right? But that's the money that paid for The Passion of the Christ. But think about makeup artists and production assistants and gophers and costume people. If every makeup artist in Hollywood was Christian, no matter what movies they're working on. Maybe you don't agree with the message of the movies, but it's the makeup artists who see the actors and actresses at their most vulnerable. It's the production assistants who are bringing them coffee and sandwiches and serving them and making their hotel reservations and plane reservations. And if we had an army of Christians doing that, representing Jesus in Hollywood, set the content aside, that's what needs to be changed. And also, if we had an army of assistants coming through to then become those development executives and studio heads. Yes, it's going to be messy. Yes, they may have to green light a show, put a show on the air they don't really agree with, but then they get to have their voice in the room. Yes, it's messy. It's different for everybody. And I love what you said, that, two different people making the same decision, it might be God's will for each of them, one going this way, one doing this. That's what's really key. And so I just think we have to think wider, think more strategically about the arts, about culture, about comedy, about Hollywood in general, maybe go our own way, build our own networks, but I don't want to abandon what's going on in Hollywood, nor the people here. So
well, and I liked your Daniel analysis, because another thing that was interesting, and it kind of continues to coalesce with what you said earlier, is like you said, they didn't go on a fast. They literally said for permission, hey, could we try it this
Right.
way?
They had
Can we just
another
try
option.
it this way? Just
Yeah.
try it and see what happens. And that's kind of what you tell me you did in
Right.
70 show. You said, hey, you guys, just an idea.
Yeah.
What if we said this instead of that? Just
Yeah.
to see what would happen. And I have I did a student film years ago, and it was just when I was getting started, just trying to get into films. You're so desperate. Please give me a chance. I want to do this. I want to get in front of the camera. I want to practice. I want to see if I'm any good. And I had to say the F word and just once. And at that point I was kind of all into the acting. Said, listen, it's not me. It's this guy. That's how he talks. What the heck? I
Yeah.
mean, what are you going to do? The people are different and so forth. And when I got to the set, um, I remember thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, Brad, you've made a living proving to your fans that you can be just as edgy as the other guy, but not have to curse. So you've kind of proven a point. Now you're going to suddenly come over here and say this. I felt like in some ways I was betraying a brand that I had been creating.
Yeah.
And so I said to the director, I got an idea for this actor. Instead of him saying this, I think it'd be funnier or more interesting, whatever I did. It was kind of a BS way of trying to get away with not having to say the word. And he said, well, let's shoot both of them. And I never saw it. I don't think anybody ever did. It was a student film. I'm guessing he left in the F word. But it taught me a lesson about as a Christian,
Yeah.
a lot of lessons. But one of the lessons he taught me was I believe if you're truly seeking God, he gives you permission to do it wrong sometimes so that you can evaluate and say, okay, I'm going to do it differently. Now that I see a perspective I couldn't have known, yeah, I'm not going to do it like that anymore. Now, the problem with filmmaking is it lasts forever. So once you're on screen, it will never, nowadays with social media and the
Yeah.
internet, it literally is like God's view of your life that's always on screen. It will be there somewhere. This interview you and I are having 100 years from now is going to show up because that's what it looks like now on the internet.
Now I want all of your fans to
Yeah,
search the internet to find that scene of Brad Stein
yeah, I don't know.
saying
I doubt.
whatever he said.
Yeah,
That's
I doubt it. Like I said, it was a student film, so I'm sure it had no platform.
somewhere. Yeah.
But it was that one and only time. Though I might have said one language, like maybe damn, I might have said once or something. But I will say this, and this is the other part, and not trying to get too, um, I don't know, not trying to be too uh, creative or esoteric with this thing. But here's another truth that I think is overlooked. If I went to somebody and said, listen, we only do faith-based films. That's it. Sorry, that's what we do. Great, got a great idea. It's a pitch. Yeah. All right, this guy's a voyeur, huh? Okay, he watches women shower. But here's the deal. It's different because he also has sex with them. Well, wait a minute. But then he kills the husband and takes her, and they have children. It's a faith-based film. They're going to go, what do you get out of my office? You go, oh, so the story of David is inappropriate for faith-based films. Well, I got a better one. Two daughters have incestual sex with their father, and it turns out badly, but there is some good redemption at the. What are you talking about? I see. So biblical stories that God Almighty said, I want this story told for eternity, is inappropriate for the faith-based filmmakers who are the arbiters of what good faith-based films are. And this is the problem, Dean, that I have dealt with, and you and me are in the exact same boat because we probably had the conversation with every producer or director of faith-based films, is we feel constrained and hamstrung sometimes
Yeah.
with how far and how creative and how sophisticated we can get with our storytelling. This is not about seeking an excuse for compromise or suddenly having some topless woman or some F-bomb in our I'm not trying to even advocate for that. What I am saying is I think that if it is contextually true and comports to a redemptive Christian perspective, I don't think God necessarily gives a crap, honestly, but that's very sophisticated and mature and not easy place to navigate.
If I could speak to everybody who watches film or television and Christian film especially, it's about understanding story,
Mm.
um, and understanding that the entirety of the Old Testament is a story, is a story of the Israelites. It's really our story. Jesus's parables, Jesus's life as a story, Scripture as a story. The first act of Scripture is the first three acts, first three chapters of Genesis, and then the rest of the story is the second act, and then the Book of Revelation is kind of the third act. But just understanding that things add up to things, and so you say contextualizing, and yes, language can be damaging, nudity can be damaging. But one of my favorite movies of all time is a movie called Lars and the Real Girl, which is about a guy who orders a sex doll off of the internet. It's Ryan Gosling
Yeah.
before Barbie. Not a swear word in it. Christian characters in it. Literally, the line "What would Jesus do?" is in it, and that movie should be shown in churches. But some Christians might go, "Oh, it's about a sex doll. I'm not going to watch that."
Yeah.
Again, what do movies add up to? There
Mm.
are limits to language. I understand it. Nudity has its own complications.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is, can we get Christians to understand? I'm not a fan of these websites that count the number of swear words or count, try to figure out where, can you figure out what the Christian worldview is, and whether it's G-rated or not. I'm not a fan of The Little Mermaid because it's mostly a movie about a girl who disobeys her parents and runs off and won't even talk until a boy kisses her, right? But something like The Lion King has Christian themes in it. A lot of the Pixar movies have Christian themes in them, even if they're not about Christian characters. That's what I'm talking about. And I want Christians to seek out those kind of movies. Again, we talked earlier, it's not a matter of whether it's safe, it's whether it's good.
Yeah.
And some of these Christian movies are safe, but I don't know. Are they good? I don't know. They make us feel good, but I want to see Christians in other movies utilizing their faith, caring for widows and orphans, loving people, demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit. How do we tell those kind of stories in an entertaining way? You do it with your comedy. I'm trying to do it with television, pitching different shows out there. In my plays, I'm putting Christian characters in my plays. Really, I just want to see Christian characters, who aren't idiots, again, utilizing their faith.
Well, but Dean, I've said this for years because I experienced it. Christians in America are trained to judge content instead of context. That there's a depth sometimes to the way things are being done and why they're done in a certain way. That if you don't have the maturity to differentiate what is trying to be told here and why it's being told this way. I mean, seriously, why should I show kids in Sunday school Goliath being beheaded?
Yeah.
I mean, that's about as graphic as it gets, because people have really beheaded people in human history. Christians are butchered regularly by ISIS. In 2015, that Coptic Christians were. So that ain't funny. It's not simple. It's as brutal and graphic as it gets. So to act like this is inconsequential, that you're cutting a guy's head off and hanging it up and saying, "Yay, look what God has done." Come on, man. That's mature stuff. That's some heavy stuff. And so we don't think about it as though it needs to be evaluated and saying, well, why would God tell that story and be comfortable with it unless there's a deeper way to see the world that Christians don't want to deal with because it's messy and they want their faith-based films. The touchdown always happens, the healing always takes place, and everything I wanted comes true. Oh, by the way, the atheist gets saved. That ain't real.
There were a lot of Christian colleges won't even allow their students to watch R-rated movies. And this was a big thing when The Passion of the Christ came out. A lot of people said, well, I won't see R-rated movies. Passion of the Christ is rated R. So what you talk about, content versus context, I'm going to steal that. Again, I can't believe I'm calling you wise and full of good thoughts. But it's exactly right. It's the challenge that we as a Christian audience need to understand that we can't be siloed off. Context rather than content is really the key. Same.
But it makes us look unsophisticated. It really does. We should be the champions of arts. We left the Sistine Chapel as our legacy at one time. Why aren't we the most able to understand the storytelling and the depth of the storytelling? Because the truth of the matter is, the Bible even tells us we aren't supposed to judge the unbeliever because they're already judged.
That's
That's
right.
the person we're supposed to come to and try to be of assistance, to give them a cup of cold water and to give them some sense of love and dignity because they're already doomed. The only time we're asked to kind of be judgmental is to fellow believers who are supposed to know better and to do better. Then we have to say, dude, your fruit ain't there, my friend. I need to help you because you're representing us. Well, listen, as it's gonna, I mean, I don't mind keeping talking, Dean, but I don't want to leave you in case you have to go. But this has been a great conversation and
Been
an
a lot of
important
fun.
one.
Been a
Yeah,
lot of fun. Yeah, I love being able to mix it up on this level,
yeah.
and it was
Well,
fun to reminisce about our foray into
oh no, it was
trying to get ourselves on
wonderful,
the air.
and it was a great experience. I'm glad I was able to have that, and you know, we're not finished. I'm still here. You're still. Who knows what
I'll
God
say
might do?
this for you're talking about how to be kind of savvy, what we're and how we funded the arts. What we're missing nowadays is patrons. The Medici family funded Michelangelo and
Yeah.
Botticelli and Da Vinci. And I speak to a lot of rich Christians who complain about the culture, and they're right to complain about the culture. But we have to start using some of our Christian wealth in funding artists, in
Yeah.
finding material, whether it's fellowships and scholarships or short films or even at colleges and full films. And I do have some Christians now who are putting their money where their mouth is, developing different kinds of scripts. And again, there's a whole new lane now for independent television
Well,
where
what do you think about The Chosen?
yeah. So I'm not a big fan of biblical dramas, is
Okay.
what it comes down to. So
I'm just curious as far as a
yeah,
format, as
the
ability.
format, it has changed the world. It has changed the playing field, and that there are 4 or 5 shows, right, independently funded shows, meaning that generally Disney or Warner Brothers funds the making of shows. Well, now The Chosen was crowdfunded. There's other shows out there that are just taking someone else's money and making a show and then putting it into the culture. That's happening a bit more now, and I think it's the model that Christians are actually at the forefront of, because with The Chosen, a couple other shows, there's an animated show some friends of mine did called Dead Sea Squirrels, one of the creators of VeggieTales. It's going to be on Amazon coming up in the next couple of months. I think it's on Minnow right now. They got outside funding and then they sold it to a network after it was made. That's what I think Christians should be doing. That's the Sistine Chapel model. Let's make it over here, and then if it's good, The Chosen is now on Amazon. It was on all sorts of streaming services. So that model, I do think, is the future because it's using our money, showing the world we can do good stuff. And then they're going, hey, this might make us money. We're not ready to risk our own money to make it, but we might be able to make it over here. So that's why I
Well,
really like the model. And I think Christians should be funding, be patrons of the arts.
and that might be the way you circumvent that uh,
That's right.
presuppositional worldview that
That's right.
causes them to say no, is that once you've already done the hard work of getting it on the air and it proves its point by actually having real revenue return,
Yeah,
it's not a risk now. They
that's
can
right.
just throw it in there like, well, I'm just being savvy enough to add this element to it, and we're gonna scoop immediately dough, and I'm gonna look good. So they're, oh well, let's use Satan's,
And
minions to
and
get our work out there.
that's right. And there are new platforms, different streaming services. Also, you could just, bradsteinetv.com
Yeah.
and put your sitcom on there if we had
Yeah.
$10 million. So if any of your listeners have $10 million,
Yeah,
make a
yeah,
sitcom
right.
starring Brad,
Me and Dean are ready to make a
we'll finally do.
show.
We got the pitch all ready to go. Yeah.
Well, folks, as you know, I also have one last guest for my question for my guests for subscribers of the Militia of the Mind, $3 a month, just to help me do my unorthodox way of talking about God in the ways that I do it through live comedy and through my podcast and through maybe filmmaking, whatever. I got a movie coming out, or we're going to film this fall. But anyways, so Dean, I want to give you one last question that like I said, it just goes to my subscribers, but because you are an expert and a professional writer, producer, showrunner, so forth. So you've done it in the trenches, in the real world, not in the Christian world, which doesn't necessarily mean it can't be great, but oftentimes it's mediocre. Let's just be honest. So I would say to you, curiously, what would you consider the greatest Christian film and or series that no one would think of as Christian? I know that's what writers like yourself do get, is you see the story differently because you're more looking for the nuances of it. You're more looking for the steps towards an end game that you think has a redemptive process. Because all truth is God's truth, and frankly, all true stories are God's story, just rewritten in
Yeah.
another format. So, what would you consider maybe the greatest Christian film and or whatever
Yeah.
that, but wouldn't be intuitively, oh, of course he's going to say, and
Yeah.
maybe it is, but is there one out there that we thought, wow, I never would have thought of that as the
Yeah.
Christian? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a TV show that was called NYPD Blue. And
Wow,
it was
interesting.
on for 11 years from about 1993 to 2004. And it got popular with
What?
Christians in the early days because it really pushed the boundaries of language and nudity. But the showrunner himself said it was a show about the redemption of Andy Sipowicz. And that show, you had to get to the nudity and the language, but they had him talking to Jesus in an episode. They had him kneeling at his son's bedside, praying for the redemption of his son. They had other Christian characters who came through, some who had not been Christian and had become Christian and saved from sin, literal sin, as they moved on. And when you look at it as the whole, where the guy started and where he ended were very different characters, and it was about his redemption. So that's kind of my really wild card.
That's amazing. But and I don't think I ever saw that.
Yeah.
Were Christians involved then?
Well, so the showrunner is a guy named David Milch, and he has spoken and written a lot about his faith. He's was a drug addict and went through Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. He knows faith very well. He also created Deadwood and some other shows that had issues of faith in them, really gritty, tough
Wow.
faith. So
That's some hardcore. I
that's
mean,
right.
Deadwood
Yeah.
was interesting, and honestly,
Yeah.
sadly, a lot of the most interesting shows, you really do have to
Yeah.
trough through the mud and the language and the
Yeah,
crassness.
and it
It's
may not be
hard.
worth it. May not be worth
Yeah,
it.
it's
David
rough.
Milch is very much a theist. I don't know if he'd call himself a Christian. But anyway, that show is kind of my wild card. I already mentioned Lars and the Real Girl, which again, no language, no sex in it, even though it's about a sex doll. That's the one that I like to say really represents the kind of art that I'd like to make of Christian community coming around and healing a person. And then there's another movie from 1941 called Sullivan's Travels, which
Yeah.
is my favorite movie of all time, Preston Sturges, and it's about a comedy writer who wants to make art with meaning, but he ends up in a scene in a church, realizing that laughter is a gift from God, and laughter is a thing that can bring people to faith and healing. I think it's one of the best movies ever made from, I think, 1941, Joel McCrea and Veronica Lake. If you like black
Nice.
and white
Yeah, no, I
movies,
have heard of that, and
yeah,
that is so cool. They were a little bit more sensitive to faith
yeah,
elements back in
they
those
were,
days.
yeah,
And
yeah,
by the way, they were very successful films, the Ten
right,
Commandments, and
yeah.
and this and that. So, again, it goes to
They
show
got
you.
around that. You talked about the rules you got to fit, whether it's language or not, but they got around the Hays Code and kind of
Yeah,
made even better movies because I'm not saying we need to return to the Hays Code. I just know they worked within the limits.
yeah.
So it's really worth watching for the social issues at the time. But again, the Christianity that eventually emerges in that movie. So
No,
it's a
that's beautiful. Well, folks, this has been my friend Dean Batali. I want you to know something, not that it's a commercial, but what the heck? A lot of believers watch or listen to my show. It ends up all over the place, like any show does, because that's what the internet can do. It's a free form, free for all. Stick it wherever you want. If you're out there, let's say you're a Christian and you got some dough, you're responsible for that money. You're responsible for doubling it. That's what God said. If I give you five, I want five more. If I give you three, give me three more. If I give you one, don't complain. Make me two. And so we do have a responsibility to the gifts and treasures God has given to us. And so if you do think that filmmaking or I don't know, plays or anything along that line, uh, from a Christian perspective matter and are important, and you wring in your hands, where is our stuff? Well, what if you're a piece of that puzzle and you haven't put your money where your mouth is? So if you want to reach out to me or to Dean, I'm sure he has a website or some means, and if so, we'll put it up here on the camera. Reach out to him, or if you have an idea, or even if you maybe want to be a screenwriter, you're a Christian, I'm sure he would be happy to encourage you, because I know that's a part of his heart, is helping the next generation be able to carry the torch, because we're not going to be here forever. But this is what we're trying to do. And if you feel a call or a tug, who knows? Maybe God has a place for you to come to with Dean, and see if you guys can help each other together. But that'll be between you and the Lord. I just wanted to give you that option. But Dean, thank you so much. Thanks for being a man of integrity all these years in Hollywood. We need you.
Thanks, Brad.
We say a prayer for him, guys. It ain't easy. You're always going to be pulled to hither and fro in that world, but some beautiful stories have come from it, and I hope this was one of them. So, folks, remember, if they ever say you're being politically incorrect, always say thank you for the compliment, because you're a Christian and you are the last truth teller on earth. So always speak truth at all times, not to be evil, not to be malicious, but because truth is more important than sensitivity if it will help people come to Christ. And remember, I'm just a comic, an actor, whatever. And apparently, based on what Dean says, I'm a genius, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
It's reluctant. It's reluctantly.
I know it,
Yeah.
but he said it, so I got to deal with it. At least it can be a quote on my bio, but I am doing this. I'm doing what I'm called to do, which is simply putting the woke back to sleep. See you next Monday.